Welcome to Revenge Blaze, your destination for the most intense and satisfying stories of justice, family secrets, and hard-earned redemption. We are dedicated to bringing you tales where the truth finally catches up to those who hide behind lies. Do not go anywhere because today's story is a gripping masterpiece of betrayal and legal reckoning that you absolutely cannot miss. Without further ado, here is today's story. My mom demanded an apology until the lawyer showed up and crushed her world. I'm Jillian Maxwell, and I'm 28 years old. Last night, on the windswept terrace of our Southampton estate, my mother stood up in front of 40 of New York's most powerful elite and treated me like a criminal because I refused to sign away my life's work to my brother. The salt air was freezing, but my face burned so hot I could feel the throb of my pulse in my jaw. As the waves crashed against the jagged rocks below, my mother's voice cut through the sound of the storm sharper than any blade. She demanded that I kneel and apologize to my brother Dominic for my selfishness, while the entire crowd watched, some smirking behind their crystal wine glasses, others whispering about the difficult Maxwell daughter. I looked her dead in the eye, took a breath of the icy Atlantic air, and said just one word: "Fine." The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving a deceptive calm over the coast. My mother knocked on my bedroom door, a cold, victorious sneer already on her face. "Finally learned your place, haven't you?" she mocked. But when she pushed the door open, her breath hitched. The room was stripped bare. No blueprints, no suitcase, no trace of the daughter she thought she could break. Before she could scream for the servants, the heavy iron doorbell rang. Standing on the grand porch was the family lawyer, his face pale and his hands trembling as he gripped a briefcase containing documents my mother never dreamed existed. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrifying mix of pity and dread, and whispered, "Madam, what have you done?" Before I reveal the devastating secret hidden inside that briefcase and how it turned my family's world into ashes, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you believe that justice is a dish best served cold. Drop a comment below letting me know which city you're watching from and what the local time is right now. Now let me take you back to the beginning of this betrayal, to the night the ocean claimed more than just the tide. The scent of salt and expensive wax always reminds me of the day the foundation of my world cracked open. It was a humid Tuesday in July when the call came. My father, Maxwell. Maxwell, a man whose lungs were practically filled with the Atlantic breeze, and whose heart beat in rhythm with the diesel engines of his beloved fleet, had collapsed on the deck of his flagship vessel. He was 65, a titan of naval architecture, and the only person in that cold marble-floored estate who ever saw the fire in my eyes as something other than a nuisance. I remember the clock in my workshop stopped at exactly 4:44 p.m., as if time itself knew that the man who held our family together had finally let go of the helm. By the time I reached the hospital, the air in the corridor felt thick with something more sinister than grief. Victoria Maxwell was already there, standing like a mourning statue in a black designer suit that looked far too prepared for a sudden tragedy. Beside her was Dominic, 31 years old, and wearing a smirk he tried and failed to hide behind a silk handkerchief. They didn't look like a family losing a patriarch. They looked like two predators watching a wounded lion. Victoria didn't hug me. She didn't even look at me. She simply checked her Cartier watch and murmured about probate schedules and interim management. I stood there, my hands still stained with the blue ink from the yacht blueprints I had been working on, feeling like an outsider at my own father's deathbed. The funeral was a grand theatrical display of Southampton's old money hypocrisy. White lilies smothered the cathedral, and the mahogany casket was polished so brightly I could see my own exhausted reflection in it. Victoria gave the eulogy, a 10-minute masterpiece of performance art where she mentioned the Maxwell legacy 20 times and her son's future leadership 15 times. She spoke of Dominic as if he were the second coming of Neptune himself, despite the fact that the closest he had ever come to designing a ship was playing with a plastic tugboat in the bathtub until he was 12. My name, however, never crossed her lips. It was as if I were a ghost wandering the aisles of my father's final farewell. The real storm broke exactly 2 hours after the burial. I returned to the estate, hoping to find solace in my father's private study, the place where we had spent countless nights debating hull displacements and sail curvatures. But as I reached the heavy oak doors, I found 2 uniformed security guards standing there like stone gargoyles. Victoria was right behind them, holding a glass of sherry and a set of new keys. "The study is sealed, Jillian," she said, her voice as sharp as a shard of glass. She didn't call me honey or daughter. It was always just the name spat out like a bitter seed. "Your father was sentimental. He allowed you to clutter this house with your hobbies. But the business is now in Dominic's hands. We need professional space, not an arts and crafts corner." Dominic sauntered up behind her, jingling the keys to my father's vintage Jaguar in his pocket. "Don't take it personally, sis." He chuckled, though the malice in his eyes said otherwise. "Mother thinks your boat drawings are a bit too feminine for a billion-dollar shipyard. We've already moved your things to the gardener's cottage by the pier. It's rustic. Very starving artist of you." I felt a hot, searing coal of fury ignite in my chest. That rustic cottage was a drafty one-room shack where the roof leaked every time the tide got too high. They weren't just moving my office, they were evicting me from my father's life. When I tried to protest, reminding them that I was the one who had actually finished the designs for the new Argos series, Victoria laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh, it was the sound of dry leaves being crushed under a boot. "The Argos series belongs to Maxwell Marine Jillian, and as the new majority shareholder, I've decided to list Dominic as the lead architect. It looks better for the investors. A strong male heir, you understand. You're just a girl who likes to draw pretty shapes. Go to your little shack and try not to get salt on your charcoal." The logic of their cruelty was as consistent as the tides. In the Maxwell household, the golden son could do no wrong, even if he couldn't tell a rudder from a mast without a manual. Dominic had spent his 20s failing out of 3 different business schools and racking up gambling debts in Macau, yet Victoria treated his every stumble like a strategic pivot. Meanwhile, I had graduated top of my class in naval architecture, working 18-hour days in the grease and grime of the shipyard to earn my father's respect. My father saw my value, but Victoria saw me as a threat to her perfect patriarchal narrative. The first night in that damp cottage was the longest of my life. The walls smelled of wet cedar and old fishing nets. I sat on the floor surrounded by boxes of my life's work that had been tossed out like trash. Through the tiny, salt-crusted window, I could see the lights of the main mansion glowing on the hill, the house my father built now occupied by people who didn't know the difference between a keel and a crown. I remember finding a small wooden carving of a dolphin my father had made for me when I was 6. It was the only thing they hadn't managed to break or lock away. As I held it, a strange sense of calm washed over me. Victoria thought she had docked my ship permanently. She thought that by taking my office and my title, she had taken my power. But she forgot one thing. My father was a man of secrets and safety valves. He knew exactly who his wife and son were. He used to tell me, "Jillian, when the fog is thickest, you don't look at the horizon. You look at the charts I drew for you." I realized then that Victoria hadn't just sealed the study to keep me out. She had sealed it because she was terrified of what was inside. She was desperately searching for something she couldn't find, and her panic was disguised as arrogance. I looked out at the dark, churning Atlantic and whispered into the cold air, "You want a war, Victoria? You've got one. But you're sailing into a storm you're not equipped to handle." I didn't cry. Maxwells don't cry. We calibrate. And as the rain began to lash against the shingles of my tiny shack, I started drafting a new kind of blueprint, one that wasn't for a ship, but for a reckoning. The air in the old shipyard south of the main estate smelled of stagnant water, rusted iron, and decades of forgotten ambition. I stood at the threshold of Shed 17, the very place where my father had taught me how to read the soul of a ship long before I could even drive a car. This morning, however, the shed wasn't a sanctuary. It was a crime scene of neglect. A massive yellow demolition pending sign was slapped across the corrugated metal doors, a parting gift from my brother. He wanted to pave over my father's history to build a wellness retreat for people who had more money than sense, and he had given me exactly 6 hours to clear out 50 years of memories before the bulldozers arrived. Inside, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of the Atlantic tide against the rotting wooden pilings. Dominic had already sent a crew to scavenge anything of obvious value, leaving behind a graveyard of splintered drafting tables and half-empty cans of marine varnish. I watched a family of seagulls squabbling over a discarded sandwich crust near the slipway, and couldn't help but find the irony delicious. Even the birds in the Hamptons were aggressive about real estate. His idea of clearing out had been to throw my father's handwritten notebooks into a corner like common trash. It was a classic Dominic move. If it didn't have a gold leaf frame or a high resale value, he considered it invisible. I moved toward the center of the shed where the skeletal remains of an old racing sloop, the Lady Genevieve, sat on rusted cradles. This boat had been my father's obsession, a project he'd started for my mother 30 years ago, and then abandoned when he realized Victoria preferred diamonds to salt spray. I climbed onto the deck, the wood groaning under my boots as if complaining about the humidity. As I began to pull a heavy, oil-stained tarp off the stern, I tripped over a loose floorboard. It didn't just rattle. It thudded with a hollow metallic ring that didn't belong in a wooden hull. Kneeling on the grimy deck, I used a rusted marlin spike to pry up the plank. Nestled deep within the bilge, tucked inside a custom-fitted niche that only a master shipbuilder would think to design, was a heavy Pelican-style black waterproof box. It was covered in a layer of gray silt and grease, looking more like a piece of engine debris than a treasure chest. My father used to say that the most important parts of a ship are the ones you can't see from the pier, and as I pulled the box out, I realized he had been talking about more than just ballasts. My hands were shaking as I wiped the grime from the lid. There was no keyhole, just a heavy-duty combination latch. I tried the obvious numbers: first birthdays, anniversaries, the coordinates of the estate. Nothing worked. Then I looked up at the rafters of the shed and saw the old wooden nameplate of my father's first boat, the Jillian's Grace. I entered the hull number, a sequence of digits I'd memorized when I was 7 years old. The latch clicked open with a sound that felt like a gunshot in the empty shed. Inside, wrapped in vacuum-sealed plastic, was a thick stack of documents that made my breath catch in my throat. The first was the original, unedited, irrevocable trust agreement stamped with a notary seal that had never been filed with the family's primary law firm. It wasn't a distribution plan managed by Victoria. It was a total transfer of the Maxwell maritime patents and the Southampton waterfront acreage directly to me. My father hadn't just left me a job. He had left me the ground beneath our family's feet. But as I dug deeper, I found the real reason he had hidden this box in a rotting shed instead of a bank vault. Beneath the trust was a manila folder labeled Insurance Discrepancies, Argos Project. Inside were wire transfer receipts from a private account in the Cayman Islands, all signed by Dominic Maxwell. My brother hadn't just been unlucky with his previous business ventures. He had been systematically draining the insurance payouts from my father's shipyard accidents to fund a spiraling gambling habit in London and Macau. The documents showed that the fire in the upholstery shop 3 years ago wasn't an electrical fault. It was an orchestrated payout of $4 million that vanished into Dominic's personal accounts within 48 hours. I sat on the dusty floor of the Lady Genevieve, a cold laugh escaping my lips. The Golden Sun wasn't just a failure, he was a common thief. And Victoria, in her desperate quest to protect the Maxwell image, had likely been covering his tracks while accusing me of being a financial burden. I pictured my mother at the yacht club sipping her afternoon gin and tonic and complaining about how expensive my naval architecture degree had been, while her favorite child was burning the family business to the ground for a seat at a high-stakes baccarat table. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive in a twisted Hampton sort of way. The roar of an engine outside snapped me back to reality. A sleek silver SUV pulled up to the shed, kicking up gravel. Dominic stepped out looking every bit the pampered heir in his tailored linen shirt and Italian loafers, which were far too expensive for a construction site. He checked his watch, the same one he'd probably bought with stolen insurance money, and strolled into the shed with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Time's up, Jillian," he called out, his voice echoing off the metal walls. "The demolition crew is 2 minutes out. I hope you finished playing in the dirt. I'd hate for you to get crushed by a wrecking ball. It would be so messy for the insurance paperwork." He stopped 10 feet away, noticing the black box in my lap. His smirk didn't vanish, but his eyes narrowed, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his face before he masked it with arrogance. "What's that? More of Dad's old junk? Give it here, I'll have the guys toss it in the dumpster for you." I stood up slowly, clutching the box to my chest. "It's nothing you'd be interested in, Dominic. Just some old blueprints for a hull that actually stays afloat. Something you wouldn't understand." Dominic took a step closer, his voice dropping an octave, losing its playful edge. "I said give it to me. Everything in this shed belongs to Maxwell Marine, and as the CEO, that means it belongs to me. Don't make this difficult, Jillian. You're already living in a shack. Don't make me take that away too." I looked him dead in the eye, feeling the weight of the evidence in my arms. "You're right, Dominic. Everything in here belongs to the person who actually owns the land, and I think we're both about to find out exactly who that is." I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his, and didn't look back as I headed for my beat-up truck. As I pulled away, I saw the first bulldozer rounding the corner. Dominic stood in the shadows of the shed, watching me leave, his posture rigid. He thought he was destroying a shed, but he had no idea he had just handed me the match to incinerate his entire life. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It was time to talk to a lawyer who didn't work for my mother. The rain in Manhattan during late autumn has a way of making the glass skyscrapers look like jagged teeth biting into a leaden sky. I sat in the furthest corner of a dimly lit bistro on Upper West Side, a place so discreet that even the waiters seemed to be part of the shadows. I had spent 3 hours on the jitney from Southampton, clutching the black waterproof box to my chest like a shield. My hair was a salt-matted mess, and my jeans were stained with shipyard grease, making me look like a vagrant who had accidentally wandered into a sanctuary of silk and mahogany. In a city where everyone was trying to be seen, I was desperate to remain invisible until the right moment. A man approached the booth, his silhouette sharp and authoritative. He was wearing a gray herringbone coat that probably cost more than my first boat, but his eyes behind a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles held a warmth that was entirely absent from the Maxwell estate. This was Sterling, the only lawyer my father ever trusted, the man who had been quietly removed from the family payroll by Victoria the day after the funeral. He slid into the seat opposite me, checked the perimeter with a practiced glance, and ordered a black coffee without looking at the menu. "You look like you've been through a hurricane, Jillian," Sterling murmured, his voice a low baritone that cut through the soft jazz playing in the background. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I slid the manila folder from the black box across the table. I watched his face as he scanned the documents. I had expected surprise, perhaps even a legalistic frown, but instead his jaw tightened until I thought his teeth might crack. He reached the insurance receipt signed by Dominic and let out a long, slow breath that sounded like a tire-leaking air. "Your father called me 3 weeks before he died," Sterling said, leaning in so close I could smell the faint scent of cedar and expensive tobacco. "He was terrified, Jillian. Not of the sea, but of the monsters he had raised in his own home. He knew Dominic was gambling away the shipyard's future, and he knew Victoria was orchestrating a massive cover-up to protect their social standing at the yacht club. He told me he'd hidden the truth where only a true Maxwell architect would find it. I leaned back, my heart pounding against my ribs. He left me the waterfront acreage sterling and the patents, but Dominic is already moving bulldozers. They're trying to turn the shipyard into a spa for people who are afraid of getting their cuticles dirty. Sterling's expression shifted from professional concern to something much darker, a look of genuine disgust. He reached into his own briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal papers bound by a blue clip. "It's worse than that, Jillian, much worse. While you were mourning in that gardener's shack, your mother and brother were busy filing a petition with the Suffolk County Surrogate's Court. They are trying to erase you as a person." He flipped to the third page where a paragraph was highlighted in a neon yellow that felt like a slap to my face. The petition, signed by Victoria Maxwell and supported by a professional evaluation from a questionable doctor, claimed that I was suffering from severe emotional instability and cognitive decline brought on by the trauma of my father's death. They were seeking to have me declared mentally incapacitated to manage my own affairs. If a judge signed this, I wouldn't just lose the land. I would lose my legal right to sign a contract to spend my own money or to even live independently. I would be placed under a permanent conservatorship with Dominic Maxwell as my legal guardian. A dry, bitter laugh bubbled up in my throat. Incompetent? I'm the only one in that family who knows how to calculate hull displacement without a calculator. My brother thinks a diversified portfolio means betting on 3 different horses at the Kentucky Derby, and I'm the one who's unstable. Sterling gave a grim nod. "It's a classic Hamptons power play, Jillian. It's about optics. If they can paint you as a broken, hysterical girl who's lost her grip on reality, no investor will listen to your claims about the trust. Victoria has spent the last month whispering in the ears of every influential person from Southampton to East Hampton, telling them how heartbroken she is about your fragile mental state. She's paving the way for the court to see her as the saintly mother protecting her poor, troubled daughter." The sheer level of calculation was breathtaking. Victoria didn't just want the money. She wanted to cage me so I could never speak the truth. She wanted to turn my father's shipyard into a tomb for my reputation. I looked at the signatures on the petition. My mother's handwriting was elegant and looped the same script she used on gala invitations. It was the handwriting of a woman who could destroy a life without ever smudging her lipstick. "How do we stop them?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Sterling tapped the black box. "We annihilate the narrative. This trust is irrevocable, and the evidence of Dominic's fraud is ironclad. But we need to play this carefully. If we file a countersuit now, Victoria will use her connections to delay the hearing for years while Dominic sells off the land. We need to catch them when they think they've already won at the peak of their arrogance." He leaned back, a small predatory smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "There's a board meeting tomorrow morning at the estate, isn't there? Victoria has invited the primary investors of the Argos project to witness Dominic's appointment as lead architect. She's even ordered a $5,000 cake to celebrate." "I wasn't invited," I said, thinking of the fine I had uttered on the terrace. "You don't need an invitation to enter your own house, Jillian." Sterling replied, his eyes gleaming behind his glasses. "I've spent 20 years playing by the rules of people like Victoria Maxwell. It's time we reminded them that the law doesn't care about social standing or yacht club memberships. I've already contacted the New York State Insurance Fraud Bureau and the District Attorney's Office. They are very interested in Dominic's Cayman adventures." He handed me a small encrypted thumb drive. "Inside is a digital copy of the trust and a sworn affidavit from your father's physician, Dr. Aris, taken the week before he passed. It confirms your father was in perfect mental health and that he was terrified of Victoria's influence. It's the silver bullet to their incompetency claim." I took the drive, feeling its cold, metallic weight in my palm. For the first time since my father's heart stopped, I didn't feel like a ghost or a victim. I felt like an architect again, but I wasn't designing a hull. I was designing a trap. Go back to the estate, Jillian, Sterling said as he stood up adjusting his silk tie. Stay in that shack. Let them believe you've surrendered. Let Dominic have his little celebration. I'll arrive at precisely 10 a.m. with the documents that will turn their cake into ashes. And Jillian wears something that says, "You're ready to take back your shipyard." I think it's time the Maxwells learned that you don't mess with the person who holds the blueprints. I watched him walk out into the Manhattan rain, his figure disappearing into the crowd of umbrellas. I stayed in the booth for a long time, sipping my cold coffee. The Hamptons elite always talked about legacy, as if it were a fragile antique to be polished and hidden away. They didn't understand that a real legacy is built of steel and truth, things that don't break, no matter how hard the tide hits them. Tomorrow my mother would find out that the daughter she tried to declare incompetent was the most dangerous architect she had ever met. I checked my watch. It was time to catch the last bus back to the coast. The morning fog rolled off the Atlantic like a funeral shroud, dampening the meticulously manicured lawns of the Maxwell estate. Victoria Maxwell marched toward the gardener's cottage, her heels clicking against the stone path with the precision of a firing squad. She was draped in a silk morning gown, clutching a silver tray with a single crystal glass of chilled grapefruit juice, her version of a peace offering, before she delivered the final blow. In her mind, the game was already over. She had spent the night rehearsing the speech she would give to the probate judge about Jillian's unfortunate decline, and all that remained was to force her daughter to sign the voluntary conservatorship papers. She didn't knock. Victoria didn't believe in privacy for those she deemed unstable. She shoved the cottage door open, ready to find Jillian huddled in the shadows. "Jillian, darling, I've brought you some refreshment," she called out, her voice dripping with a calculated, honeyed pity. "We really must stop this theatrical brooding. Dominic has the surveyors coming at noon, and it's time we put your father's little shipyard to better use. Just a quick signature on these medical forms and we can move you to that lovely facility in Connecticut. It's very soothing for the nerves." Her words were met with a silence so absolute it made the hair on her neck stand up. The cottage didn't smell like damp cedar anymore. It smelled of nothing. No scent of shipyard grease, no lingering aroma of charcoal pencils, just the sterile chill of an empty room. Victoria's eyes darted to the corner where Jillian's drafting table had been. It was gone. The shelves that had been sagging under the weight of marine engineering manuals were bare. Even the small wooden dolphin carving was missing. The cottage wasn't just unoccupied, it had been surgically erased. The crystal glass slipped from Victoria's hand, shattering against the floorboards. For a woman who prided herself on having an answer for every crisis, the sight of that empty room was like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. She rushed to the small closet, flinging the doors open only to find empty hangers. Panic began to claw at her chest. Jillian hadn't just left. She had taken every piece of leverage Victoria thought she held. All the evidence of Jillian's supposed mental breakdown, the frantic sketches, the unwashed mugs, the cluttered workspace had vanished, leaving behind a space that looked as sane and orderly as a courtroom. Before Victoria could find her breath, the roar of a high-performance engine tore through the silence of the coast. She stumbled out of the cottage to see Dominic's charcoal gray Porsche screaming up the driveway, narrowly missing a row of prize-winning hydrangeas. Dominic Maxwell practically fell out of the car, his designer sunglasses lopsided and his complexion a sickly shade of gray. He wasn't the arrogant heir anymore. He looked like a man who had just watched his golden parachute catch fire. "Mom, where is she?" Dominic shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He didn't wait for an answer, pacing frantically on the gravel. "The Suffolk County Planning Department just called. They've issued a total stop work order on the Argos Wellness Project. They said the title for the waterfront acreage is under legal cloud and that Maxwell Marine's claim to the land has been flagged for fraud." "Fraud, Mom?" The investors are blowing up my phone, and the foreman says, if the bulldozers stay idle for another 24 hours, we're looking at hundreds of thousands in liquidated damages. Victoria grabbed her son's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. What are you talking about, Dominic? You told me the deed was in the corporate vault. Dominic shook his head, his eyes darting toward the main mansion as if he expected the walls to start crumbling. The clerk's office says a private trust filed an emergency injunction an hour ago. They've frozen the entire shoreline. And it's not just the land, Mom. The insurance company for the shipyard fire. They've halted the final payout. They received an anonymous tip about undisclosed financial patterns and Cayman Island accounts. Someone has been digging Mom deep. The realization hit Victoria like a rogue wave. She looked back at the empty cottage, the silence of the room now feeling like a mockery. She had spent weeks treating Jillian like a fragile ornament she could break at will, never realizing that while she was playing social games at the yacht club, her daughter was calculating the exact coordinates of their destruction. The fragile girl had outmaneuvered the matriarch. Find her, Dominic. Victoria hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and genuine fear. I don't care what it takes. Call every hotel, every marina, every friend she ever had. If she thinks she can humiliate this family and jeopardize our standing, she's more delusional than I thought. Dominic let out a harsh, jagged laugh. I tried her phone, Mom. It's disconnected. I even called the shipyard crew, and they said she showed up at dawn, took her personal equipment, and told them the new boss would be in touch soon. The new boss. She's not hiding, Mom. She's hunting. As they stood there in the gray Hamptons light, surrounded by the luxury they had stolen and the lies they had woven, the first drop of rain began to fall. It was a cold, sharp rain that signaled the end of the summer season. Victoria looked up at the main mansion, and for the first time in 30 years, the heavy stone walls felt like they belonged to someone else. The tide was coming in, and for the Maxwells there were no more lifeboats left on deck. The grand dining room of the Maxwell estate was bathed in the deceptive warmth of a crystal chandelier, but the atmosphere inside was as brittle as dry ice. Victoria Maxwell sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her spine as rigid as a mast, presiding over a breakfast that felt more like a court-martial. Arrayed before her were four of the most influential real estate developers in New York, all waiting for Dominic to deliver the final presentation for the coastal resort project. Dominic himself was a nervous wreck, his hands trembling as he adjusted his silk tie, his eyes darting toward the heavy double doors every time the wind rattled the window panes. He had spent the last hour trying to explain away the minor administrative delays, but the investors were starting to look at their watches. Victoria raised her bone china teacup, her voice projecting a forced regal calm. Gentlemen, I apologize for my son's scattered energy. Losing a patriarch is never easy, and my daughter Jillian's unfortunate mental state has added a heavy burden to our family's focus. However, I assure you that the deed to the Southampton waterfront is firmly in Maxwell hands. We are merely finalizing the conservatorship details to ensure Jillian is properly cared for in a private facility before we break ground. She paused, offering a saintly practiced smile. In the Hamptons, we take care of our own, even when they've lost their way. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they were flung wide with a force that made the silverware on the table chime like a warning bell. Sterling marched into the room, his gray overcoat billowing behind him, looking every bit like the storm the Maxwells thought they had outrun. He wasn't alone. Standing directly behind him were two officers from the Coast Guard's investigative branch and a deputy sheriff from Suffolk County, their uniforms a stark contrast to the silk and velvet of the dining room. The investors stood up in unison, their faces shifting from boredom to alarm as the scent of salt air and authority filled the space. Victoria didn't lose her composure immediately. She set her teacup down with a delicate click and narrowed her eyes at the lawyer she had fired months ago. Sterling. This is a private family meeting and a high-level investment briefing. Officers, I'm glad you're here. This man has been harassing my family and filling my daughter's head with delusions. I'd like him removed from my house instantly. Sterling didn't flinch. He walked to the center of the room, unclasped his briefcase, and placed it directly on top of Victoria's silk placemat. That's the thing about property, Victoria, he said, his baritone voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling with a terrifying clarity. It only belongs to you if the name on the title matches the name on your driver's license, and as of this morning, yours doesn't. He pulled out a thick notarized document and slid it across the mahogany surface toward the investors. Gentlemen, if you sign any contract today, you are engaging in a conspiracy to commit large-scale real estate fraud. This waterfront acreage, Shed 17, and the entire Maxwell Marine Shipyard were never part of Maxwell's general estate. They were placed into an irrevocable trust 8 years ago, with Jillian Maxwell as the sole beneficiary and absolute owner upon her father's passing. Dominic lunged forward, his face turning a mottled shade of purple. That's a lie. I've seen the will. Jillian is incompetent. The deputy sheriff took a step toward Dominic, his hand resting casually on his belt, and the arrogant air suddenly found his feet very interesting. Sterling looked at Dominic with pity. Your medical filings? Dominic are based on an evaluation from a doctor who has already been stripped of his license this morning for accepting a $50,000 bribe from your mother's private account. We have the wire transfer records. And as for Jillian's incompetence... Sterling turned back to the doors. I stepped into the room wearing a tailored navy blazer and the same determined expression my father used to have. I wasn't the grease-stained girl from the shack anymore. I was the architect of their downfall. I walked to the head of the table and stood directly opposite Victoria, who was now clutching the edge of the mahogany so hard her knuckles were white. The shipyard is mine, Mother. I said, my voice steady and cold. And the Argos patents, and the coastal land Dominic tried to sell behind my back. Victoria let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, her mask of grace finally cracking. You think a piece of paper makes you the master of this house? This is my home. Jillian Maxwell built this for me. Sterling reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a final document. Actually, Victoria, that's the biggest lie of all. We've completed the title search on this specific mansion, the Southampton estate. Maxwell purchased this property in 1991 using the inheritance from his own mother, but he never put your name on the deed. 4 years ago, he updated the deed to transfer ownership to the trust upon his death. The trust that Jillian owns. He looked around the room, making sure every investor and officer heard his next words. Victoria, you aren't the mistress of this manor. You are a guest of your daughter, a guest who has spent the last month trying to have her legally erased so you could steal her land. Under the terms of the trust, your right to reside here was contingent on fiduciary harmony with the beneficiary. By filing that incompetency petition and conspiring with Dominic to misappropriate insurance funds, you've breached every clause in the agreement. The room went silent. The investors didn't say a word. They simply gathered their portfolios and backed out of the room like they were escaping a sinking ship. Dominic collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, as one of the Coast Guard officers stepped forward and presented him with a federal summons for insurance fraud. Victoria looked at me, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. You can't do this, Jillian. I'm your mother. Where am I supposed to go? I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. You spent 30 years making sure I knew I was less than Dominic. I said, my voice echoing in the vast empty room. You tried to lock me in a cage so you could keep the keys to a house you never owned. There is no misunderstanding, Mother. There is only the truth. And the truth is, you've run out of dock space. Sterling checked his watch and nodded to the deputy. Madam, we have a court-ordered eviction notice effective in 24 hours. I suggest you start packing. And I'd leave the silver. Jillian has the inventory list from the 1990s and will be checking every box. As I stood there at the head of the table watching the woman who had spent my entire life trying to break me finally crumble, I realized that the salt air didn't smell like grief anymore. It smelled like freedom. The Maxwell anchor had finally dropped, and for the first time, I was the one at the helm. The heavy silence that followed Sterling's announcement was thick with the metallic tang of fear. Victoria Maxwell sat frozen in her silk-backed chair. Her eyes darted from the legal documents on the table to the stern faces of the officers, then finally to me. She was desperately searching for the Jillian she had spent 28 years molding the quiet, compliant daughter who would eventually cave. But that girl was gone. Dominic Maxwell, on the other hand, had moved past shock into a frantic defense. He stood up, knocking his chair backward. "This is absurd, Jillian. You've clearly manipulated these records. I've dedicated my life to this company, Mom. Tell them. Tell them this is just her trying to get back at us for the cottage." I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I pulled a second manila folder from Sterling's briefcase. "Let's talk about dedication, Dominic. Or rather, let's talk about the Lady Genevieve, the Blue Horizon, and the Argos 3. 3 vessels, 3 accidents in 2 years, and 3 massive insurance payouts." I slid a series of color-coded bank statements across the mahogany. The Coast Guard investigators found it curious that every time a Maxwell yacht accidentally struck a submerged object, you were the only one on the maintenance logs. These boats didn't hit rocks, Dominic. You intentionally disabled the sonar and ran them into the shallows to trigger the insurance clauses. And here are the wire transfers, $4 million in total, moving not into Maxwell Marine, but into an account linked to a high-stakes club in London. You didn't just fail as a businessman, you burned Dad's legacy to pay for your gambling. Dominic's face went translucent white. He looked at Victoria, his mouth working but no sound coming out. My mother, however, finally found her voice. It was a shrill, desperate rasp. "Jillian, stop this madness immediately. Even if what you say is true, think of our name. We can handle this internally. We are a family, and families protect each other." "Protect each other?" I asked, a dry, joyless laugh escaping my throat. "Is that what you were doing when you filed a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent? You didn't want a daughter, Mother. You wanted a scapegoat. You and Dominic spent 30 years treating me like an inconvenient footnote, and now you're asking for family loyalty. That's not loyalty. That's a ransom request." The deputy sheriff stepped forward, placing the formal eviction notice directly in front of Victoria. She stared at the bold black lettering. "Jillian, you can't be serious," she whispered. "Where would I go? People will talk. I'll be the laughingstock of the entire coast." "It's not your home, Victoria," I said, using her name for the first time without the mom that usually felt like a weight. "It hasn't been your home since the day Maxwell died. He knew exactly what you were. He left this house to me because he knew I was the only one who actually loved the shipyard more than the social status. You have 24 hours to pack your personal belongings. The silver, the artwork, and the furniture stay. They are trust assets, and I've already authorized a full audit." The transformation in Victoria was sudden and ugly. She stood up, leaning across the table, her eyes filled with venomous heat. "You ungrateful, treacherous little girl, I ensured you had the best education, the best clothes, the best life. And this is how you repay me, by siding with a lawyer to steal my roof. You're just like your father, cold, obsessed with machines, and completely devoid of heart. You'll be alone in this big, empty house, Jillian. No one will visit you." "I'd rather be alone in a house I own than surrounded by people who are trying to steal my sanity," I replied. "As for Dominic, the Coast Guard and the district attorney have a lot more questions about those London wire transfers. I suggest he finds a lawyer who specializes in federal fraud." Dominic suddenly fell to his knees, clutching the edge of my blazer, a mess of tears and snot. It was the most pathetic thing I had ever seen. "Jillian, please, Don't do this, I'll work in the shipyard, just don't let them take me. Victoria didn't help him. She looked at her son with a flash of genuine disgust, but her pride was still her primary weapon. She straightened her gown and looked at me with a cold, hollow sneer. Enjoy your victory while it lasts, Jillian. You might have the deed, but you'll never have the respect of this town. We'll leave. But don't expect a single person in Southampton to ever speak your name again without spitting. I can live with that, I said, signaling the officers that I was finished. 24 hours, Victoria. At noon tomorrow, the locks will be changed. If you or Dominic are still on the property, I'll have the deputy here escort you off for trespassing. I turned and walked out of the dining room, the sound of Dominic's sobbing and Victoria's muffled curses following me. For the first time in my life, the Maxwell estate didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a shipyard. It was a place where things were built, and where only the strongest designs survived the storm. I walked out onto the terrace, breathing in the sharp, salty air of the Atlantic. The tide was out, and the horizon was clear. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool metal of the brass key, my key. The family anchor had been cut, and I was finally free to sail. The winter sun over Southampton felt different this year, sharper, cleaner, and devoid of the suffocating pretension that used to hang over the Maxwell estate. It had been exactly 6 months since the locks were changed, and the heavy mahogany doors closed behind the only family I had ever known. In the Hamptons, gossip travels faster than a private jet, and the fall of the Golden Sun and the Ice Queen had provided enough conversational fuel to last the entire season. People who once laughed at my mother's garden parties were now whispering about her unfortunate relocation, proving that in this town loyalty is only as deep as your bank balance. Dominic Maxwell's descent was as swift as a ship with a hole in its keel. The federal investigation into the shipyard insurance fraud was relentless, aided by the surgical precision of the documents I'd found in Shed 17. 3 months ago, he accepted a plea deal that included heavy fines and a mandatory stay in a minimum security facility. The man who used to complain about the thread count of his hotel sheets was now learning the hard way that the government doesn't offer room service. Sterling told me that Dominic spent his first week in custody trying to bribe a guard with a designer watch that had already been confiscated. Some people never learn that the game has ended. Victoria Maxwell's exit was less loud but far more pathetic. She had moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a utilitarian building in Queens, a place where the view wasn't of the Atlantic but of a laundromat and a subway line. She had tried to sue the trust for spousal maintenance, but the evidence of her conspiracy to commit medical fraud had silenced her lawyers. I heard through a distant cousin that she still wears her pearls to the local grocery store and tells anyone who will listen that she is between estates. It's a tragic comedy of a woman who built her entire identity on a house she never owned. As for the estate, the first thing I did was cancel the Argos Wellness Retreat. The half-paved parking lot was ripped up to make room for the restoration of the shipyard. Shed 17 is no longer a graveyard of memories. It is the beating heart of Maxwell Naval Architects. I spent the winter on my knees in the shipyard dirt not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There is a profound joy in watching a derelict hull come back to life. I've hired back the old crew. My father loved the men who actually know how to build things, and we are currently drafting the blueprints for a new series of sustainable wind-powered vessels. We call it the Eleanor series, not after a saint, but after the truth. I haven't spoken to Victoria or Dominic since the day I handed them the eviction notice. People often ask me if I feel guilty. My answer is always a calm, steady no. In the Maxwell family, silence was used as a weapon for decades. Now I use it as a boundary. Forgiveness requires accountability, and my mother and brother are still too busy blaming the tide for their own shipwreck. I've learned that cutting ties isn't an act of cruelty, it's an act of survival. You cannot sail forward if you are still tethered to an anchor that is trying to pull you under the waves. To those of you listening, especially those who have spent years being told you aren't enough or that your passions are mere hobbies compared to the real work of others, believe in your blueprints. My father didn't leave me a fortune, he left me the proof that he saw me. He knew that the quietest person in the room is often the one calculating the strongest trajectory. Liking yourself is the best revenge, and standing your ground is the most powerful design you will ever create. Life is a series of storms, but as long as you hold the pen to your own story, you are the master of the sea. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Your support means the world to me, and I genuinely hope Jillian's story has given you the courage to check your own charts. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps me bring more of these tales of justice and resilience to life. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on the ending. I read every single one of them and appreciate your insights. I wish you all health, strength, and the luck of a clear horizon. Stay bold, stay true, and remember, never let anyone else steer your ship. I'm Jillian Maxwell, and I'll see you in the next story.